tears turn to laughter, that child long ago. My soul starts to linger, it's home I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me alone to that place we call home.
The Village. For authors Alice Munro and Robertson Davies, it was a stage for their subjects. Andy Clark, the mayor of Little Places, brought us his radio broadcasts. Remember Neighborly News? For Stephen Leacock, it was that little place in the sunshine that one day he would return to. Whether it means having known the communities of Europe or growing up in a 1920s prairie's crossroads, the idea of village life conjures up an image that is different in all of us. I grew up in the small town of New Liskeard in northern Ontario, that vast territory up there that people in the southern part of the province still don't really understand. It was similar to other somewhat isolated communities. Our entertainment consisted of the radio, of course, watching the evening train pull in, that was big, and the 10-cent Saturday matinee at the old Empire Theatre on Armstrong Street. There is so much nostalgia attached to it. By equating it with today's society, it's difficult to tell whether or not we were better off. Maybe the good old days were tougher than anything the later generations experienced. In this episode of Sketches of Our Town, we're going to explore the theme of village life, retracing the footsteps of one of Canada's foremost painters, the last of the group of seven, A.J. Casson. Casson has devoted most of his 70-year career as a painter to recording and capturing a disappearing way of life. He witnessed the changing times and the impact of road building and rural electrification, modernization. Although he focused mainly on Ontario villages, his work is enjoyed internationally, and his subjects continue to invoke the captured emotion of a day in the life of the village.
I was born in Toronto, but when I was about 5 years old, my family moved to Guelph. And I think it was living in Guelph in those days that gave me a love of the countryside, because Guelph was almost like a big village in those days.
And so it happened, the spark of creativity that was to inspire the young Alfred Casson. His palette of colors and passion for drawing and painting were all the baggage needed for the pursuit of unending ideas. The landscape beckoned, and getting there was all important.
Young people today don't realize none of us had cars, but we had one thing that was great: the radio cars. One ran from just south of St. Clair up to Sutton. Another one ran from West Toronto out through Brampton to Guelph. And there was one ran out the lakeshore to Port Credit, and one down to the halfway house on the Kingston Road. I think the fare to Guelph was 30 cents return. Well, we could use those. You could get off at Streetscape, Norwell, any of those. That's where a lot of my sketching was done. The early things I did Most of them were out around Norval and Brampton on that road that goes between them. There were a lot of old buildings there I did. Another little spot nobody ever heard of, Greensville. It's just up the hill from Dundas. It was there before Dundas. And the only sketch I know that's left of that is a watercolor I made of the mill. It was a paper mill, and I made a sketch of it. Where the early things are, I don't know. And I did an awful lot of port credit and destroyed them all. You know, you think when you get a little older, the early stuff's no good. I wish I'd kept them. They were the old stone hookers that used to be out there. They've been perhaps not very good sketches, but they've been a record of that.
After Guelph, it was Hamilton for his early schooling. But by his teens, along with his family, Casson was back in the city of his birth. Toronto, in the early 1900s, offered opportunity for artists in the developing field of commercial art. It was on his first day at the firm of Rouse & Mann that Casson was introduced to someone whose influence would last for decades. Senior designer Franklin Carmichael not only demanded excellence, but he himself set the standard. The name of the game in advertising was color and design, and only the best would survive. Filtering into this job market came a collection of minds that would change forever the Canadian art scene. Meeting at the Adelaide Street Arts and Letters Club for lunch, they would soon formalize the Group of Seven.
In the commercial art field in those days, there were some characters in it, believe me.
Characters like Lorne Harris, Arthur Lismer, Frank Johnson, Fred Varley, J.E.H. MacDonald, and Alex A.Y. Jackson.
I was on several sketching trips with him. He tried in the early days to get me to go to Quebec to paint the villages with him, but I was afraid if I went, I'd see everything through his eyes. I admired his work so much. And that was really where I got started on the villages. Nobody was doing anything here. They may have painted an old mill or something, but very few things of villages, the stores or anything. So I got working on that. Well, once I did, and he started to encourage me on it. But it was through the club I got into the art world. And some of them, like Carmichael and Jimmy MacDonald, took a real interest in what I was doing, helped me.
Throughout the country, mechanization altered a way of life. The horseless carriage demanded its right of way, and in the wave of road building to follow, the separate identity of many small communities started to disappear. Paved highways competed against water and rail in transportation. For Casson, most often in the company of his mentor, Frank Carmichael, the automobile offered an extended reach into new territory.
We used to go up to Severn Bridge and sketch, and some of the little villages way up Yonge Street, they were just villages in those days. We used to paint, well, landscape quite a bit, but sometimes, like around Bradford or Holland Landing, we'd paint the old houses or old stores, watercolors as a rule. I don't think in Frank's days he ever sold a sketch for more than $35. That was the going price, framed. And with one of his came up in an auction, sold for $22,000. I told my wife, she said, I'll bet Frank's rattling around in his grave saying that damn fools could have had it for $35. He was that kind of a person, you know.
In 1927, Casson followed Carmichael over to the firm of Sampson Matthews. They continued their excursions, sometimes with other members of the group, north to Lake Superior. Well, by this time, Casson had befriended Joachim Gautier, another designer at Sampson Matthews. Together, and occasionally with Carmichael, the trips remained an important part of their agenda.
Joe and I camped together and painted together for years, and we camped all over the place. He and Carmichael were the best campers I ever knew. Some of the trips we took the train, but by that time we had cars, and we'd drive, take a tent and stuff with us. And then in later years, Joe and I found out we could rent cabins. That was before motels. There were cabins, and some of them had cooking facilities. They're pretty crude, but at least you're out of the weather. We had one up at Otter Lake, a log cabin. We rented it sight unseen. You had to cook outside on a campfire, no heat in the cabin. We were 2 weeks there. Said it was middle of October, it got a bit chilly.
Hey, look at that. Look at that.
The camaraderie that went beyond the place of business was cherished among the artists. Also interesting, something which occurred in many instances in the early art scene, was a silent support offered by individual patrons and employers, appreciative of the role of the artist in society. The Sampson Matthews organization was one of these. Joe Gautier's son, Paul.
Well, I can remember Chuck Matthews telling me, he said, when Cass and Dad wanted to paint during the summer months, he would give them a week off, with pay, as far as I understand it. And they would go away for the week, come back with some nice watercolors and that, and of course, Chuck had a good eye for painting, and he'd always choose 2 or 3 of their work, and of course, they gave them to him without any question, because he allowed them this time off, and this was just his way of encouraging them to paint.
And paint they did. No obstacle could stifle the drive to understand and interpret this wonderment of light and color that the villages and landscape provided.
There's a little lake up near Combermere. I'm trying to think of the name of it. It's a little beauty. And Joe and I were there one cold fall morning, very cold, clear, and on the beach. He sat there and we built a little fire in between us, and we took turns putting. And you know, that little bit of fire made the difference. You could work. I'd like to get up and see that country again, but maybe I will someday.
By the 40s, the group of 7 had disbanded, replaced by the Canadian group of painters and other schools of thought that were following much the same path. Casson's first major exhibit was still 10 years away, but with a secure income as a senior designer and his wife Margaret as a traveling companion, he tirelessly pursued his subject. The nation had lived through the Great Depression and was now emerging from the Second World War. And Casson watched as the character of the communities changed. He used his artistic license to lock them into a simpler time and place. That also may have meant that he was not embracing the changes all around him.
We would sometimes be going out to Credit Fort, and we'd leave around 6 o'clock at night to get there. Well, we had to go in those days out to Weston and up. Once we got away from Weston, we might go there and not see 3 cars. There's nothing. It's hard to believe that. I got out in Glen Williams by accident. My wife and I were driving out there somehow, and we heard of this village, and we went down to it, and in those days, it was a real rural village, and we did what we often used to do, go to the local postmaster or minister and tell them what I wanted to do, and we'd get accommodation in somebody's house. Well, there's a farm on the edge of Glen Williams, and the home was in the old bobbin mill, a huge old place. Well, they give us a room in the front and a bedroom, and then they gave us our meals, and I went back there time after time and did stuff. Those days, Glen Williams had some great things in it. Well, I suppose from my early days with my old grandmother and that, taking me to the land out to Brampton and that, I got to know some of the characters, and I realized that to do these village things right, you had to get to know the people. So instead of just going in and out, my wife and I would get a place and stay there and get to know the villagers. And you got the feel of the place, what it was like. You got behind just the facade of it. That's how we got into a lot of villages, like Parry Sound. We didn't know anything about Parry Sound, and we drove there. The first year we had a car, 27. Well, the minute you left the end of Yonge Street, it was gravel road. It took us from 8 in the morning till 6 at night to get to Parry Sound. I had a broken spring. The road through Muskoka was awful. Almost anywhere. If we would go and ask somebody if we could rent their cottage, they'd look at us and they'd figure, well, that old couple aren't going to mess it up or anything. We got some nice places. I think one of the really funny things, up the York River, when you're going into Batiste, before you get there's a road runs up the York River, and it comes at a farm at the end of the road. Well, we went up there one day, and there was a nice frame house on the side, and I went way up on the top of the hill. There was a barn. Oh, it was a beauty. Best I'd ever seen, and I made a big watercolor. I've still kept it. And I saw the woman of the house come out and lean on the car and talk to my wife. Well, when I came down, I said, I suppose you heard the gossip. She said, I couldn't understand a word she said. Well, I said, that's too bad. I'm coming back tomorrow. I want to make another up there. Same thing happened to her. I said, what did you learn today? She said, I got the whole thing. She put her teeth in.
From the hamlets of Elora and Salem on the Grand River, Dwight near Algonquin Park, Manchester and nearby Port Perry on Lake Scugog, to Prince Edward County, jutting out into Lake Ontario, Casson continued his work with the same conviction as ever. With the advent of the shopping center competing for the retail dollar, the streetscape began to change radically in the 1950s. In some communities, progress meant knocking down and flattening the past and replacing it with the new. Some towns were lucky, though. They couldn't afford anything but to cover up their old buildings with new materials, which indirectly and ironically led to their preservation. Soon, though, the four-lane highway would ignore them altogether.
I just got there when the change was beginning to come. Somehow or other, those good old stores and that don't look right with a cement road and, you know, sidewalk. You've got to put the gravel on the boardwalk and leave hydrants out and the telephone poles. Put it back in the period. In the early days, there was plenty just around the outskirts of Toronto. One of the best old houses I ever did. A farmhouse is on 401 on the north side, just this side of Markham, up on a bank. Well, there was no way, even if I went over to that side of the road, that I could see it. And it was the winter time. So I pulled off the road, and I remember saying to my wife, well, look, you're not supposed to park on 401. So I got out and lifted the hood as though I was in trouble. Now I said, you watch, and if you see an OPP car, let me know and I'll put the sketch stuff away. Well, I made a very careful pencil drawing and notes. And I came back and I made a 2430 of it. It was one of those old farmhouses that the living room part came out with a window. Then at the other end of the little thing, there had been a veranda. Well, it had gone. I had to reconstruct that. I finished it, and this was about a month later, and I said to my wife, let's go out there and I'll recheck that. It was gone. Just luck. Bulldozed out. You had to get them. No, they disappear. Some of the old places I did, it was kind of in your mind. You're trying to think, what was this like? What were the people like when they first lived here? And I'd have to go back to think of when I was a little boy, what I saw them. It's a struggle to put yourself into another period. It had to be done. I had my fun out of it.
So the Bard of rural Ontario, Alfred J. Casson, has left us a vivid and touching documentary of the village life. Born at the time of the Industrial Revolution, his observations have spanned 2 world wars, a depression, men walking on the moon. Yet, through all these changing times, he never lost his focus, nor his love of the subject, capturing it with his sketchbook and brush, freezing it in time. For many of us, whether from New Liskeard or Prince Rupert or Antigonish, this visual record will preserve the village for future generations as the way we were.